Your grandmother was a criminal, not by her standards, not by the standards of 1973, not by any measure that made practical sense, by ours. Habit number 15 on this list is something she did in her kitchen every autumn for 40 years. The Food Standards Agency now explicitly advises against it. Habit number 6 is a criminal offense under the 2003 Licensing Act, fines of up to £1,000. And habit number 1 is not illegal at all. It is simply gone, because the knowledge required to do it safely was never written down and nobody thought to ask before it was too late. These were not dangerous habits, they were practical ones. The danger came later, and it did not always come from the habits themselves. Subscribe, because what follows is going to make you angry in the most useful possible way. Let us count them down. Habit 20, selling eggs from the garden gate, the little sign on the gate post. Fresh eggs, 50 pence a dozen. She had 6 hens, and the neighbors had fresh eggs every week. Nobody filled out a form. This was normal in Britain through the 1970s. Backyard hens, surplus eggs, a handwritten sign. No labeling, no grading, no registration. Just eggs in a paper bag and coins over the garden fence. The Food Safety Act 1990 changed this. EU egg marketing regulations made it worse. Eggs sold to the public must now be graded, date-stamped, and sold through registered packers. A casual garden gate sale in a suburban setting breaches trading standards and food safety law. The Trading Standards Institute confirmed this in guidance updated in 2019. The eggs are still warm from the nest in a paper bag. The shells slightly rough and speckled, each one different, each one real. Nothing like the smooth, identical ovals in a supermarket box. The bureaucratic apparatus required to sell 6 eggs legally today would have been unrecognizable to someone keeping chickens in 1973. The regulation did not make the eggs safer. It made the supermarket's eggs harder to compete with. That was not an accident. Habit 19, home slaughtering of backyard pigs. In rural Britain through the 1960s and into the 70s, the pig at the bottom of the garden was not a pet. It was the winter's food supply, and the family dealt with it themselves. Smallholders kept a single pig through summer, slaughtered it in autumn, and preserved the meat through winter. A practice continuous from medieval times. The pig killing was a community event. Neighbors helped with the slaughter, the butchering, the salting. They received cuts of the meat in return. Every part of the animal was used. Blood for black pudding, fat for lard, intestines for sausage casings, head for brawn, trotters for stock, nothing wasted. The welfare of animals at slaughter or killing regulations, 2012, ended it completely. All pigs must now go to a licensed abattoir, regardless of whether the meat is for personal consumption only. A family that keeps a pig today must pay abattoir costs that often exceed the value of the meat. The economics that made the backyard pig viable have been regulated out of existence. The large abattoir industry lobbied consistently for the restrictions that ended small-scale home slaughter. The regulations protected food safety. They also eliminated the competition. Both outcomes were achieved at the same time. Habit 18, selling home-baked goods without registration, the WI store, the church fete table, the school cake sale. She bought a Victoria sponge, sold it for £1, and nobody mentioned registration, allergen labeling, or food business compliance. This was not an oversight. It was simply how community food worked in Britain for most of the 20th century. Women baked, communities ate. Money changed hands at trestle tables in church halls and village greens without a single form being completed. The Food Safety Act 1990 changed the foundation. Anyone selling food to the public, even occasionally at a fete, became a food business subject to regulation. The allergen labeling requirements introduced under EU Food Information Regulations 2014 added another layer. 14 major allergens must now be declared on homemade baked goods sold commercially. The WI itself, which has operated traditional food markets since 1915, had to restructure its entire market model to achieve regulatory compliance. A woman selling homemade jam at a village fete today is legally a food business. She must register with her local authority before she spreads the first batch of fruit. The regulations were written for industrial food processors. They were applied equally to Victoria sponges at church fetes. The law made no distinction. It never does. Habit 17, buying raw milk from the farm. The milk churn at the farm gate. You brought your own jug. The farmer filled it. Tuppence a pint, still warm. Raw, unpasteurized milk was widely available direct from farms across Britain through the 1970s. Bought by families from local farms as a matter of course. No questions asked. No special license required. Scotland banned raw milk sales entirely in 1983 following a fatal outbreak. England and Wales retained a restricted sale regime. Raw milk can still be bought direct from registered farms in England, but cannot be sold in shops, supermarkets, or online for delivery. Anyone other than a registered producer who sells it commits a criminal offense. Still warm from the cow, the milk slightly yellow with cream settled at the top, poured into a jug and left on the cool larder shelf overnight, a skin forming by morning. nothing like the homogenized white liquid in the plastic bottle. Approximately 200 registered raw milk producers remain in England today. In 1970, there were tens of thousands of farms selling it without a second thought. The large dairy processors lobbied for pasteurization requirements that eliminated the direct farm-to-consumer market. The safety argument was real. The competitive advantage was equally real. Neither was ever separated from the other. Habit 16. Using saccharin without warning anyone. The little pink tin beside the sugar bowl. She dropped 2 tablets into her tea every morning from 1965 until the early 1990s. Nobody warned her about anything. Nobody was required to. Saccharin was widely used as a sugar substitute in British home cooking and baking through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, available from chemists and supermarkets. Unremarkable. Ordinary. In 1977, the United States banned saccharin based on studies showing bladder cancer in rats at extremely high doses. Britain did not follow. The ban was reversed in 2000 after the National Toxicology Program concluded the rat studies were not relevant to human consumption at normal levels. The EU Food Information Regulations 2014 introduced mandatory labeling requirements for sweeteners in food sold commercially. Homemade food sold without this labeling is technically non-compliant. Cancer Research UK confirmed in 2021 that saccharin does not cause cancer in humans at normal levels. The 1977 scare was based on doses equivalent to hundreds of cans of diet drink per day. The sugar industry funded and promoted the cancer studies that led to the original ban. The industry that stood to benefit most from the saccharin scare was never asked to prove its own product safe by the same standard. Habit 15. Bottling meat at home. The row of Kilner jars on the larder shelf, sealed and processed, rabbit, chicken, or pork that would last the year without refrigeration. She had learned it from her mother, who had learned it from hers. Home bottling of meat in sealed Kilner jars was practiced widely in rural Britain through the first half of the 20th century and into the 70s. The method involved packing meat into sterilized jars, sealing them, and processing in a water bath to create a vacuum seal. The Women's Institute Preservation Guides withdrew home meat bottling instructions from their publications in the 1960s, not because of regulation, because of botulism. Clostridium botulinum produces a toxin in low-acid anaerobic environments that is odorless, colorless, and lethal. A jar can look and smell perfectly normal. The Food Standards Agency now explicitly advises against all home bottling of low-acid foods, including meat. This is one entry on this list where the regulation was genuinely about safety rather than market protection. She was not wrong to do it. The science simply caught up with something she had no way of knowing. The jars cooling on the counter, the lids dimpling inward as the vacuum formed. The satisfaction of food preserved against the winter. A practice that looked safe because it had always been done until it was not. Habit 14. Making sloe gin and selling it at the village fete. The bottles lined up on the fete table. Sloe gin, damson vodka, elderflower wine, homemade labels written in biro, £1.50 each. She had been making them since the 1950s and selling them since the 60s. Nobody had ever asked about a license. It is still legal to make sloe gin at home for personal consumption. You can give it as a gift. You can drink it yourself. The moment you accept money for it, you are committing a criminal offense under the Licensing Act 2003. Fines of up to £1,000 apply. HMRC alcohol duty requirements mean that selling homemade alcohol without paying duty is tax evasion, as well as unlicensed trading. The sloe gin deep crimson in the bottle, the sloes having bled their color through months of steeping. The warmth of the first December pour, moving differently from anything bought in a shop. Before 2003, the regulatory framework was less clear. Trading standards rarely pursued informal fete sales. The grey area that she operated in for 30 years no longer exists. The large drinks industry lobbied for the 2003 licensing changes that ended informal alcohol sales at community events. The safety argument was minimal. The competitive argument was significant. It always is. Habit 13. Collecting and selling wild mushrooms. The basket brought back from the woods on a Sunday morning. Field mushrooms, ceps, chanterelles. She knew exactly which ones were safe because her mother had taught her. She sold the surplus at the market without a registration number or a food hygiene certificate. Informal sales of foraged mushrooms at markets and to local shops were not systematically regulated before the Food Safety Act 1990. The knowledge of which mushrooms were safe was common enough that the risk was manageable. It was a community knowledge, passed person to person across generations. That knowledge has since collapsed. Fewer than 20% of British adults under 40 can identify 3 edible wild plants. The regulation that now governs mushroom sales was written for a population that lost the knowledge her generation took for granted. Commercial wild mushroom collectors today require food business registration, product liability insurance, and allergen labeling compliance to sell legally. The basket heavy with field mushrooms, the gills still slightly damp from the morning field, fried in butter within an hour of picking. Nothing bought in a shop tastes the same. She could name every safe mushroom in the local woods. The regulation that ended her market stall was not written because she was dangerous. It was written because the generation after her was not safe to be trusted with the same knowledge. Habit 12. Using unpasteurized cheese in school meals. The strong farmhouse cheddar on the school dinner plate in 1974, made from raw milk, properly aged. Nothing like the processed slices in the triangular foil wrappers. Nobody asked whether it had been pasteurized. Unpasteurized farmhouse cheese was widely used in school meals through the 70s, sourced locally from farms that had supplied institutions for generations. School meals regulations were revised following E. coli outbreaks in the 90s linked to unpasteurized dairy. The restrictions on raw milk products in school catering were tightened significantly. Traditional British farmhouse cheeses, Montgomery's cheddar, Colston Bassett Stilton, many territorial cheeses, are made from raw milk. They cannot legally be served in schools today. The farmhouse cheddar sharp and slightly crumbly, with the crystalline texture that comes only from proper aging, a flavor that no processed cheese has ever replicated. The smell alone told you it was the real thing. Some of Britain's finest cheeses are legally excluded from the institutions where the next generation of palates is being formed. A generation is being raised on pasteurized processed alternatives and calling it cheese. The large dairy processors who supplied the pasteurized alternatives benefited directly from the regulations written in the language of safety. The farmhouse cheesemakers who lost institutional contracts in the 90s never recovered them. Here is what the timeline shows. Between 1970 and 2000, British food safety legislation expanded dramatically. The Food Safety Act 1990, the Meat Products Regulations 1994, the Food Hygiene Regulations 2006, the Food Information Regulations 2014. Each piece of legislation was presented primarily as a safety measure. Each piece also had the effect of raising the cost of food production to a level that small producers, cottage producers, and informal traders could not meet. The large food processors who sat on the advisory committees that drafted these regulations were not opposed to safety. They were also not opposed to a regulatory framework that eliminated their smallest competitors. Both outcomes were achieved simultaneously. The language of safety and the economics of competition are not always in conflict. In British food regulation from 1970 onward, they were almost never in conflict. Habit 11. Running a street food stall without a license. The pie man, the whelk stall, the roasted chestnut cart in November, the eel and pie shop that set up on the pavement outside the market on Saturdays, all of it without a trading license, a food hygiene certificate, or a council registration number. Informal street food trading was fundamental to British working-class urban life from Victorian times through to the 1970s and 80s. The regulation of street trading was patchy and inconsistently enforced. Many traders operated for decades without formal licensing, and nobody pursued them for it. The Local Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act, 1982, gave local authorities comprehensive powers to regulate street trading. Consistent enforcement from the late 80s ended most informal trading. Food hygiene regulations introduced through the 90s added a compliance layer that the informal trader could not practically meet. The roasted chestnuts in a paper cone, burning the fingers slightly. The split shells revealing the pale, sweet interior, eaten in the street in November. Nothing before or after has tasted exactly like that. A working-class trader who wants to sell roasted chestnuts on a November street corner today needs a street trading license, food business registration, a food hygiene certificate, and public liability insurance. The regulation did not make street food safer. It made established restaurant businesses more competitive against informal traders. That outcome was not accidental. Habit 10. Making and selling sausages from home. The butcher who made his own sausages in the back room. The farmer's wife who sold them at the gate. The village shop that took a dozen links from the family next door and put them alongside the bread. None of it required a single form. Small-scale artisan sausage production was commonplace through the 1970s with minimal regulatory oversight. The meat products regulations and food safety legislation introduced through the 80s and 90s created a compliance framework that effectively ended casual sausage production for sale. A small farm shop selling 20 packs of homemade sausages a week now faces the same regulatory requirements as a large meat processing facility. Food business registration, a HACCP food safety plan, and potentially a meat processing license. Selling without these is a criminal offense. The homemade sausage with a proper skin that resisted the fork, the filling coarse and seasoned with herbs, the fat running when it hit the pan. Nothing like the pale, smooth cylinders in the supermarket chiller. The large meat processors spent the 1980s lobbying for uniform food safety standards. The standards that were passed were written in a language that only large processors could comply with economically. The village sausage did not die from lack of demand. It died in committee. Habit 9. Smoking your own fish at home for sale. The smokehouse at the bottom of the garden. 4 wooden walls and a corrugated iron roof. Herrings hung on rails over oak sawdust. She sold them at the gate for 6pence each and had done so for 30 years without anyone suggesting she needed permission. Small-scale domestic fish smoking for sale to neighbors was common in fishing communities along Britain's coasts through the 1970s. The informal smokehouse, a converted shed or purpose-built small structure, was a feature of coastal working-class households where access to fresh fish made home smoking practical and profitable. The Food Safety Act 1990 brought commercial standards to what had been an entirely informal trade. Environmental regulations on smoke emissions from food processing operations have since made even small-scale licensed smoking difficult to establish in residential areas. The herrings golden from the smoke, the skin tight and gleaming, the smell of oak and salt and cold smoked fish hanging in the air around the smokehouse for hours after the fire was out. The artisan smokeries that now sell award-winning smoked fish at £15 a side started with exactly the same equipment. They survived the regulation because they could charge £15 a side. She could not have afforded to comply. The compliance cost was not calibrated to her. It was calibrated to her competitors. Habit 8. Serving rare beef burgers in a pub. The pub burger in 1978. Pink in the middle. Proper pink. Nobody asked how it had been cooked. Nobody handed you a form to sign. Nobody suggested you might die. Pink beef burgers were standard pub and cafe fare through the 70s and 80s. The preference for medium rare was considered a sign of quality rather than a safety hazard. It was simply how a decent burger was served. The E. coli 0157:H7 outbreak at a Scottish butcher in 1996 killed 21 people and was linked to inadequately cooked minced beef. It transformed food safety regulation around burger cooking temperatures permanently. Food Standards Agency guidance following the outbreak effectively required thorough cooking of minced beef in commercial catering. The Safer Burgers scheme allows restaurants to serve pink burgers only if the beef has been through approved pathogen reduction processes. Only establishments that can afford premium beef processing can legally serve one. The pub that served a pink burger for £1 in 1978 cannot. The fine dining restaurant that charges £22 can. Same food. Very different regulatory relationship with it depending on how much you charge. The 1996 outbreak was real. The deaths were real. The regulation that followed was also real. But the outcome, that pink burgers became the exclusive right of expensive restaurants, was not unavoidable. It was a choice. Habit 7. Foraging and selling hedgerow fruit, the slowberries, the elderberries, the crab apples, the rose hips. She picked them from the hedgerows every September and turned them into jams, jellies, and cordials. She sold them at the market. She had never heard the phrase food business registration and would not have understood why it applied to her. Hedgerow foraging for preserves sold at local markets was a common rural practice through the 70s, an extension of the traditional harvesting that had sustained rural communities for centuries. Food business registration requirements mean that selling hedgerow jams at a farmer's market today requires the same regulatory compliance as a commercial food manufacturer. The EU Food Information Regulations 2014 added allergen labeling requirements that make handmade label jams technically non-compliant if sold commercially. The hedgerow in September, heavy with sloes and elderberries. The sharp smell of the sloes. The rich dark smell of elderberries warmed by the sun. The jelly set in the jar a deep jeweled color that nothing artificial has ever produced. Several trading standards prosecutions of informal jam sellers at village fetes attracted significant public anger in the 2010s. They were legally correct. They were morally absurd. The law made no distinction between her and a commercial food manufacturer. It never does, and it never explains why it should not have to. In 2011, the EU Traditional Herbal Medicinal Products Directive came into full effect in Britain. The registration cost for a single herbal remedy between £80,000 and £150,000. The number of traditional herbal products that disappeared from British shelves within 2 years, over 500. The number of those products that had caused documented harm, effectively zero. The directive was presented as consumer protection. Its effect was the elimination of small herbalists and the consolidation of the herbal medicine market among large pharmaceutical companies who could afford the registration costs. This pattern appears in nearly every area of British food regulation from the 1990s onward. Safety language. Compliance costs calibrated to large-scale production. Small producers eliminated. Large producers consolidated. The grandmother who made elderberry syrup in her kitchen for 60 years was not the problem the regulation was written to solve. She was simply eliminated alongside the problem. If you have not subscribed yet, now is the time. And drop in the comments which habit surprises you most before we get to number 1. Habit 6. Homebrewing and selling beer. The barrel in the garage, the bottles lined up in the cellar, the gallon jugs shared with neighbors, sold at the working men's club for 20 pence a pint. Nobody thought to register it. Homebrewing became legal in Britain in 1963 when Harold Wilson's government removed the requirement for a domestic brewing license. What followed was a generation of informal sharing and low-level selling that occupied a genuine regulatory grey area for 20 years. The Licensing Act 2003 ended the grey area. Any sale of alcohol now requires a premises license, a personal license, and duty payment to HMRC. Alcohol duty on beer is approximately 19 pence per unit. Selling home-brewed beer without paying it is tax evasion as well as unlicensed trading. The home-brewed bitter slightly cloudy in the glass, the head settling slowly. The flavor more complex and less consistent than anything commercial because it was made by a person, not a process. He can still brew at home and share with friends. The moment he accepts 20 pence for a pint, he is committing a criminal offense. The large brewing companies lobbied consistently for the licensing regime that ended informal alcohol sales. The working men's club barrel was competition they preferred to regulate away. The law obliged them. Habit 5. Serving food. Past its use by date. She did not throw food away because a date on a label told her to. She smelled it, tasted it, looked at it, and used her judgment. She was right far more often than the label. Date labeling on food was introduced in Britain from the 1970s onward. Before that, freshness was assessed by the cook using sensory judgment developed over a lifetime. The distinction between use by dates, which relate to safety, and best before dates, which relate to quality, is still poorly understood by most consumers. It is a criminal offense for a commercial food business to sell food past its use by date, even if the food is demonstrably safe. The date is absolute regardless of condition. WRAP, the waste reduction charity, estimates that British households throw away 7 million tons of food every year. Around a third of it is perfectly safe to eat. The mandatory use by date system was designed by an industry that profits when food is discarded and repurchased sooner than necessary. The woman whose nose told her the cheese was still good had no defense against a printed label backed by criminal law. Her judgment was accurate because she had been developing it for 40 years. The use-by date replaced that judgment. The food waste that followed was the cost nobody counted. Habit 4. Curing meat. At home for sale. The side of bacon hanging in the larder. Home cured with salt, brown sugar, and a little saltpeter. Sold to the neighbors for what it cost to make. Home curing of pork was a rural practice continuous from medieval times through to the 1970s. Families that kept pigs cured the meat and bartered the surplus without a second thought. Selling home-cured meat today requires food business registration, a HACCP food safety plan, and compliance with the miscellaneous food additives regulations. It is a criminal offense without all three: the home-cured bacon with a proper salty depth and a firmness that commercial bacon does not have, the fat rendering slower in the pan, with more flavor. The artisan producers who charged £12 for 6 rashers started from the same point she did. They survived because they could charge £12. The compliance framework was written in the language of food safety. Its effect was the elimination of small producers. The language and the effect were not the same thing. Habit 3. Adding coloring to food without declaring it. The lurid pink icing, the vivid yellow custard, the red jelly that was a color found nowhere in nature. She added food coloring to everything, and it never occurred to anyone to list it as an ingredient. Artificial colorings were widely used in British home cooking through the 70s without labeling requirements. The EU Food Information Regulations 2014 made undeclared colorings in commercially sold food a criminal offense. The Southampton 6 study from 2007 linked 6 specific colorings to hyperactivity in children. Several are now banned. Others carry mandatory health warnings. The food coloring industry lobbied against restrictions through the 80s and 90s and delayed meaningful regulation by 2 decades. The children who ate the pink icing in the 70s are now the parents reading the warning labels on their own children's food. The delay had a cost. Nobody in the industry paid it. Habit 2. Selling unprescribed herbal remedies. The jars of dried herbs behind the counter. The elderberry syrup sold for 6pence a bottle every September. The comfrey poultice for the neighbor's ankle. None of it required a license. None of it caused harm. The EU Traditional Herbal Medicinal Products Directive 2004 required registration of all herbal remedies sold to the public. Registration cost between £80,000 and £150,000 per product. Over 500 traditional herbal products were withdrawn within 2 years. customers, not because they were unsafe, because the registration cost was prohibitive for anyone except large pharmaceutical companies. The herbalist's shop smelling of dried lavender and something resinous and old, the jars with handwritten labels, knowledge passed from person to person across generations. The pharmaceutical industry lobbied for the directive. The safety argument was made publicly. The competitive argument was not. She had been making elderberry syrup for 60 years. The directive was not written with her in mind. It was written over her head. Habit 1. The knowledge that made all of it possible. None of this required a degree. None of it required specialist equipment. It required knowledge, and knowledge cannot be regulated away. It can only be forgotten. Every practice on this list was possible because a generation of British women and men possessed practical food knowledge passed down across centuries. Which mushrooms were safe, how to cure meat, how to smoke fish, how to assess freshness without a printed date. A 2003 Soil Association study found fewer than 20% of British adults under 40 could identify 3 edible wild plants. In 1953, the figure was over 80%. A population that has lost practical food knowledge is dependent on the industry that replaced it. The regulations did not cause that dependence. They made it permanent. She was not breaking rules when she sold eggs at the gate. She was exercising knowledge. The rules that came later made that knowledge illegal to act on. That is the difference between the world she lived in and the world we inherited. Tell me in the comments what your grandmother did in her kitchen that would require a license today. I still make my grandmother's elderberry syrup every September. I give it away because selling it would make me a criminal. The syrup is the same. The world around it is not. She was not breaking the rules. The rules were written after she had already been doing it for 40 years. Remember that.